The Moonstone by Wilkie Collins, dramatised for radio in 6 parts by Brian Gear, with music composed by Sidney Sager. The Moonstone, Part 4.
It is with the deepest sense of duty, coupled with the comforting knowledge of Mr. Franklin Blake's cheque awaiting me, that I take up my pen to resume the account of events relating to the Moonstone scandal. I am reminded by consulting afresh Mr. Blake's strict instructions that I am confined to events that I witnessed myself. Consequently, there will be some gaps in my narrative, which you must excuse. A month elapsed between the time of Lady Verinder's decease and my meeting Rachel Verinder again. My aunt's will left her daughter in the guardianship of Mr. Ablewhite Senior until Rachel married or came of age. In these circumstances, Mr. Godfrey told his father of his engagement to Rachel. There now arose the question of where Rachel was to reside. The house in Montague Square was associated with the calamity of her mother's death, the house in Yorkshire with the loss of the diamond, and in her present state of bereavement her residence at her guardian's house in Frizinghall would be an unwelcome check on the gaieties of the Miss Ablewhites. It ended in a proposal from Mr. Ablewhite Senior to try a rented house in Brighton. He would join Rachel and his wife later in the season, and they would have Godfrey, with the London train so convenient, always at their disposal. My Aunt Ablewhite is a large, fair-complexioned woman who has never been known to do anything for herself. The task of engaging servants for the house in Brighton was quite beyond her, and she sent for me to do it, her son Godfrey having already found the house. It was thus that I met Rachel again for the first time since her mother's death.
Drusilla, I'm so pleased to see you. I wanted to ask your forgiveness. I have spoken very rudely to you in the past.
Why, of course, my dear. A Christian is ever ready to forgive.
Thank you, Drusilla. Now, the servants. Here is the list. Cook, kitchen maid, housemaid, and
my dear, these are only wanted for the term during which Mr. Ablewhite has taken the house. We shall have great difficulty in finding persons of character to accept a temporary engagement if we try here in London. I had better go to Brighton tomorrow and look there.
Oh, that is kind of you, Drusilla. I would do it myself, but I have no experience in hiring servants. And you must stay with us there. You will stay, won't you, as my guest?
And thus the glorious prospect of interference was open before me. Rachel was clearly no longer the reckless, defiant creature whom I had last seen. This of itself was enough to encourage me to take her conversion in hand. It was then the middle of the week. By Saturday afternoon I had engaged the servants, and the house was in readiness. Between 6 and 7, Aunt Ablewhite and Rachel arrived, escorted by the lawyer, Mr. Bruff. Before going away to his hotel, he invited himself to Sunday luncheon.
You've scarcely eaten anything, Rachel, dear.
No, Aunt, I'm not hungry.
The sermon was so uplifting this morning. A whole hour of eloquence thundering through that sacred edifice.
It has given me a headache. That is really all that I can find to say for it.
You know the best remedy for a headache, Miss Rachel? A nice long walk. I am entirely at your service if you will honour me by accepting my arm.
How kind of you, Mr. Bruff. A walk is the very thing I was longing for.
Rachel, dear, it is past 2, and the afternoon service begins at 3.
You surely cannot expect me to go to church again.
The doctor says I should take more exercise.
Then will you come with us, Aunt Ablewhite?
No, dear, I don't like exercise. I shall have a nap instead. It will do me far more good.
I don't know when I have felt the solemn duty of interfering so strongly as I felt it at that moment. I was certain that Mr. Bruff had some private object in coming to Brighton, and that Rachel was concerned in it. On my return from the afternoon service, I found they had just got back from their walk. I had never before seen Mr. Bruff pay Rachel such devoted attention, or look at her with such marked respect. He had, or pretended he had, an engagement to dinner and took an early leave of us. I overheard a few words between him and Rachel at the door.
Are you quite sure of your own resolution?
Quite sure. Nothing could make me change my mind now.
There are not many young ladies who could be so much in command of themselves in circumstances like these. I have the highest regard for you, you know.
I could do nothing if I didn't have your help, Mr. Bruff.
Rachel immediately withdrew to her own room and locked the door. I made all sorts of sisterly offers through the woodwork, but the door remained locked. I felt quite cheered. Plenty of obstructive material to work on here. She came down to breakfast the next day, but she ate nothing and said hardly a word. Afterwards she wandered listlessly about, then opened the piano and began to play music of the most scandalously profane variety. It would have been premature to interfere with her at such a time. I escaped the music by leaving the house for an invigorating walk. Upon my return, I entered the dining room and found myself face to face with Mr. Godfrey Ablewhite.
Dear Miss Clack.
Mr. Godfrey!
I've been waiting to see you.
What a pleasant surprise. We did not expect you so soon.
By a happy chance, I was set free of my London engagements earlier than expected.
Have you seen Rachel yet?
I have. You are aware, Miss Clack, that she was engaged to be married to me?
Was engaged to you?
Was. It appears that upon reflection she feels that it would be best for both of us if she retracted her rash promise, leaving me free to make a happier choice elsewhere.
And have you submitted to this, Mr. Godfrey?
I have, without a struggle.
But why?
Why, indeed? I feel like a little child who, when you ask it why it has been naughty, puts its finger in its angelic mouth and says, I don't know. I don't know why I should accept her decision with such tranquillity. I only know I do.
Have you perhaps realized how much you were neglecting us at the Mother Small Clothes conversion? And has perhaps your conscience troubled you on that account, dear Mr. Godfrey?
Ah, now there you have it exactly, Miss Clack.
Ah.
How perceptive you are. It suddenly occurs to me that my true happiness is in helping my dear ladies, and in doing my modest round of useful work.
Oh.
True, I have lost an excellent social position, but I have got a position. True, I have lost a handsome income, but I can pay for my bread and cheese, and my nice little lodging, and my 2 coats a year. True, I have lost a beautiful girl, but she has told me with her own lips, this, dear lady, is between ourselves, that she loves another man, and her only idea in marrying me was to put him out of her head. Looked at reasonably, the only possible course is to submit to Rachel's change of mind.
Everything you say only shows what a fine and noble nature you possess, Mr. Godfrey.
Oh, how time flies with you, Miss Clack. I shall barely catch my train.
What, are you leaving us already?
I fear so, dear lady. Business obliges my father to leave Frizinghall for London today, and he proposes coming on here. His heart is set on my marrying Rachel, and I must tell him what has happened. There'll be great difficulty, I fear, but I must stop him from coming here until he's reconciled to it.
I will rapidly pass over the feelings of joy which assailed me when I realized that Mr. Godfrey had come back to the fold, and content myself with noting that at lunchtime it appeared to me that the recovery of her freedom had led Rachel to thinking again of that other man whom she loved. In the afternoon she accompanied Aunt Ablewhite as she took her exercise in an invalid chair, while I armed myself with the life, letters and labours of Miss Jane Ann Stamper, 44th edition, passages of which bore with a marvellous appropriateness on Rachel's present condition. The next day Aunt Ablewhite was as near to being astonished as her nature would permit by the sudden appearance of her husband. A minute later he was followed, to my astonishment this time, by Mr. Bruff.
This is a pleasant surprise, Mr. Bruff. When I left your office yesterday, I didn't expect to have the honour of seeing you here today.
I turned over our conversation in my mind after you'd gone, and it occurred to me that I might be of some use. Only just had time to catch the train. No opportunity of discovering which carriage you were in.
Rachel, my dear, I have heard some very extraordinary news from Godfrey, and I'm here to inquire about it. You have a sitting room of your own in this house. Will you honour me by showing me the way to it?
Whatever you wish to say to me, Mr. Ablewhite, can be said here, in the presence of my relatives and Mr. Bruff.
Just as you please, my dear. Some weeks ago, my son informed me that Miss Verinder had done him the honour to engage herself to marry him. Is it possible, Rachel, that he can have misinterpreted or presumed upon what you really said to him?
Certainly not. I did engage myself to marry him.
Very frankly answered. So, the error is evidently in what Godfrey told me yesterday. I begin to see it now. You and he have had a lover's quarrel, and my foolish son has interpreted it seriously.
Pray let us understand each other, Mr. Ablewhite. Nothing in the least like a quarrel took place yesterday between Godfrey and me. If he told you that I proposed breaking off our marriage engagement and that he agreed on his side, then he told you the truth.
Oh, come, my dear. Now, don't be angry, and don't be hard on poor Godfrey. He has evidently said some unfortunate thing. Well, he was always clumsy from a child. But he means well, Rachel, he means well.
Mr. Ablewhite, I have either expressed myself very badly or you were purposely mistaking me. Once and for all, it is a settled thing between Godfrey and me that we remain cousins and nothing more. Now, is that plain enough?
Am I to understand, then, that your engagement is broken off?
You are to understand that, if you please.
Am I also to understand that the proposal to withdraw from the engagement came, in the first instance, from you?
Yes, it did. And it met with your son's consent and approval.
I beg to ask you, Miss Verinder, what complaint you have to make of my son.
You are not bound to answer that question, Rachel.
Don't you forget, Mr. Bruff, that you are a self-invited guest here. Your interference wasn't asked for.
Your son, Mr. Ablewhite, put the same question to me. And my answer was that reflection had convinced me that I should best consult his welfare and mine by retracting a rash promise and leaving him free to make his choice elsewhere.
What has Godfrey done? I have a right to know that. What has he done?
You have had the only explanation I think it necessary to give to you or to him.
In plain English, it's your sovereign will and pleasure, Miss Verinder, to jilt my son.
I have exposed myself to worse misconstruction than that, and I have borne it. I have nothing more to say.
Well, I have. I have something more to say. I have to say that if my son doesn't feel this insult, I do.
Insult? What insult?
You know very well what insult, and so do I. I know it as certainly as if you had confessed it in so many words. Your cursed family pride is insulting Godfrey, as it insulted me when I married your aunt. Her beggarly family turned their backs on her for marrying an honest man who'd made his own place and won his own fortune. I had no ancestors. I wasn't descended from a set of cutthroat scoundrels who lived by robbery and murder. I wasn't good enough for the Herncastles when I married, and now it comes to the pinch my son isn't good enough for you. I suspected it all along.
A very unworthy suspicion. I'm astonished you have the courage to acknowledge it.
Surely, Mr. Bruff, this is beneath notice.
You've got the Herncastle blood in you, young lady.
Really, Mr. Ablewhite, I think you ought to control yourself. Really, I do.
Who asked you to put your piece in? Now, Miss High and Mighty, it all comes out, doesn't it? Blood will out.
Dear Mr. Ablewhite, one word.
Blood will... Eh? Who were you?
An affectionate well-wisher and friend. As one long accustomed to arouse, convince, prepare, enlighten, and fortify others, permit me to take the liberty of composing your mind.
I know you. Miss Clack. Drusilla Clack. Sit down, woman.
Don't suppose that I claim attention for my humble words. Oh, no. The blessed words of Miss Jane Ann Stamper.
Miss Jane Ann Stamper be damned.
Oh, such language in a Christian household. Where are my tracts?
And your tracks be damned too.
Here is one, entitled Hush, for heaven's sake.
Oh, there. That's what I think of. Hush, for heaven's sake. That and that. Who asked this impudent fanatic into the house? Did you, Mrs. Ablewhite?
Miss Clack is here as my guest, Mr. Ablewhite.
Oh. Miss Clack is here as your guest. In my house.
Mr. Bruff, what does he mean?
You appear to forget, Mr. Ablewhite, that you took this house as Miss Verinder's guardian for Miss Verinder's use.
Not quite so fast. I have a last word to say, which I should have said some time since if this rampant spinster had not interrupted me. I beg to inform you, Mr. Bruff, that if my son is not good enough to be Miss Verinder's husband, I cannot presume to consider his father good enough to be Miss Verenda's guardian. In your legal phrase, Mr. Bruff, I decline to act. This house has necessarily been hired in my name. I have no wish to hurry Miss Verenda. On the contrary, I beg her to remove her guest and her luggage at her own entire convenience. And now I pray you will excuse me.
My dear, I should be ashamed of my husband if I didn't know that it is his temper speaking and not himself.
Thank you, Aunt. But I have no wish to stay where I am not welcome.
You, Miss Clack, are the mischievous person who has irritated him. I hope I shall never see you or your tracts again. Now, Rachel, dear, in my husband's name, what can I do for you?
If I may be permitted to answer for Miss Verenda, might I ask you, Mrs. Ablewhite, to send Penelope down with her mistress's bonnet and shawl?
This minute, Mr. Bruff.
Leave us 10 minutes together, Mrs. Ablewhite, and you may rely on my setting matters right.
Oh, Mr. Bruff, you are a friend indeed.
Miss Clack, might I ask you to...
I, too, have an interest in Rachel. An infinitely greater one than yours, I make leave to say, concerned as it is with her Christian soul.
Rachel, my dear, you are quite right. Mr. Ablewhite is beneath our notice.
What is to happen now?
I'm coming to that. When your dear mother named Mr. Ablewhite as your guardian, I persuaded her to insert a clause in her will empowering her executors in certain events to consult with me about the appointment of a new guardian. One of these events has happened today. Now then, will you honour Mrs. Bruff and myself by becoming our guest? And will you remain as one of our family until we've settled what is to be done next?
Oh, Mr. Bruff, how kind you are. I can think of nothing that would give me greater pleasure.
Stop! Stop! I must be heard. Mr. Bruff, you are not related to her, and I am. I summon the executors to appoint me guardian. Rachel, dearest Rachel, I offer you my modest home. Come to London by the next train and share it with me.
You are very kind, Drusilla, but I have accepted Mr. Bruff's invitation, and I think it will be best if I remain under his care for the present.
Come along, Rachel. See to the packing of your things. Miss Clack, good day.
Reviled, deserted by them all, I was left alone in the room. From that day forth, I never saw Rachel Verenda again. She had my Christian forgiveness then, and when I die, she will have as a legacy from me the life, letters, and labours of Jane Ann Stamper.
My fair friend Miss Clack having laid down the pen, it is now my turn to take it up. My first task is to fill in the gap in Miss Clack's account, the conversation that took place in Brighton after Sunday lunch between Miss Rachel and myself.
I sometimes think Miss Clack's Christian zeal betrays her into overdoing things. Another service on top of this morning's would really have been too much of a good thing.
It's far too nice an afternoon to be indoors anyway. And how is your headache?
Oh, much better, thank you.
Will you forgive an old friend and servant of your family if I ask whether your heart is set on your marriage to Godfrey Ablewhite?
Let us sit on this bench, Mr. Bruff.
By all means.
To tell you the truth, I'm marrying in despair. It is at least a positive act. It will certainly change my life, which is intolerable to me at the present. I suppose it may bring some sort of happiness to it. I don't know. Does that answer your question, Mr. Bruff?
It goes some way, certainly. But Mr. Ablewhite's heart must be set on it at any rate.
He says it is. And he would hardly marry me after what I have told him unless he was fond of me.
It sounds strangely in my old-fashioned ears to hear you speak as though you were not quite sure about him. Isn't there any little doubt in your own mind about his sincerity?
Mr. Bruff, you have something to tell me about Godfrey. What is it?
It is not very pleasant.
Well, tell me.
Very well. In a word, he's marrying you for your money.
What nonsense. He doesn't need money.
How can you be sure of that? What's ample for one man isn't even a pittance for another man.
I suppose you have proof.
I have. Now let me think where to begin. I don't suppose you know, and why should you, that before a will can be acted upon, it has to be proved, as we call it. Now, all wills go to a proctor, who lodges them in Doctors' Commons. I happened to be calling on my own proctor one day, and he told me that your mother's will had been asked for and examined.
Why? And who examined
As
it?
for who, I'm coming to that in a minute. As to why, it's perfectly normal practice for anybody who applies to Doctors' Commons to be allowed to look over a will. They pay a shilling fee, that's all. But in your mother's case, there was absolutely nothing that could be contested. And I could think of nobody who would have the slightest interest in examining it, so I asked my proctor who'd wanted to see it.
Godfrey Ablewhite.
Solicitors acting for Godfrey Ablewhite.
Are you sure?
Positive. I got in touch with the solicitors concerned. It was somewhat irregular, I admit, but I have a small hold over them in the form of work that I can't be troubled with. I pass over to them. Strictly speaking, they broke confidence with their client, but you see, I was thinking of your interests.
But why should Godfrey want to see my mother's will?
I'm afraid, my dear, the cruel truth is, it must be, to see if it's to his financial advantage to marry you.
But he proposed before my mother died. He would have known then that I would one day inherit from her.
But only in general terms. He wanted to know exactly how much and when.
But why?
Let me explain. To protect you from fortune hunters, I advise your mother to draw up her will so that you have nothing but a life interest in the property.
What does that mean?
It means that neither you nor your husband, if you should marry, can raise sixpence either on the property and land or the property and money. You would have the houses in London and Yorkshire, and you would have the handsome income. But that is all.
And is that not enough for Godfrey?
That I don't know. It wouldn't be enough if he needed to raise a large sum of money quickly. But of course I know nothing of Godfrey Ablewhite's financial position. All I know is he has an interest in finding out what it would be when, or if he marries you. And that's why I'm here now. I see it as my duty to put these facts before you.
I thank you, Mr. Brough. I thank you from the bottom of my heart. If you hear any rumours of my marriage when you get back to London, contradict them at once, on my authority.
So you mean to break your engagement?
Of course. After what you have told me, it's unthinkable that I should marry Godfrey Ablewhite.
You may find some difficulty in getting him to release you from your promise.
Can you not advise me?
Tell him, the next time you see him alone, that you know about his mercenary motive, and that in the light of that knowledge the marriage is simply impossible. Then put it to him whether he thinks it wisest to secure your silence by agreeing, or if he persists in holding you to the engagement, to force you to make the facts generally known.
What if he denies it or tries to justify himself?
In that case, refer him to me.
Thank you for your advice, Mr. Brough, but I can't follow it.
You can't? Why ever not?
Don't you see? I have believed in this man. I've promised to marry him. After giving that promise, how can I tell him to his face that he's the most contemptible of all things, a mere fortune hunter? I couldn't endure the shame of it.
Your principles are admirable, my dear, but you cannot possibly withdraw from your engagement without giving him some reason.
I shall say that I have thought it over, and I think it will be best for both of us if we do not marry.
Is that all? And have you thought of what he may say on his side?
He may say what he pleases.
And what may public opinion say?
I have braved public opinion once over the Moonstone. I can brave it again over this, Mr. Brough.
My mind was in a strange conflict over Rachel when I left her that day. She was obstinate, she was wrong, but she was admirable, deeply to be pitied. I made her promise to write to me the moment she had any news. On the evening of my return to London, before it was possible to have received any letter, I was surprised by a visit from Mr. Ablewhite the elder, who told me that Godfrey had got his dismissal that very day. Moreover, he told me that Godfrey had accepted it, and so my view was proved. Godfrey Ablewhite needed a large sum of money by a given time. He'd found out he would get no help from Rachel's inheritance, and had been set free in a very timely manner by Rachel's own act. What other theory would account for his rejecting an income which would have kept him in luxury for the rest of his life? How events turned out afterwards you already know from Miss Clack. Miss Verinder honoured my wife and myself by making a long stay at our house in Hampstead until a new guardian was appointed, Mrs. Merridew, a sister of the late Sir John Verinder. Now I must take the story of the Moonstone onwards a little. About a week or 10 days after Rachel left us, one of my clerks handed me a card and said that a gentleman was waiting to speak to me. There was a foreign name, I forget now what it was, and a line written in English at the bottom of the card which I remember very well. Recommended by Mr. Septimus Luca. The audacity of somebody in Mr. Luca's position presuming to recommend anybody to me. I was just about to refuse to see the man when my clerk told me he thought he was an Indian. Convinced immediately that the Moonstone was at the bottom of it, I had the man sent up. He was tall, he was dressed in European clothes, he was very polite, and spoke excellent English, but he was unmistakably an Indian.
I have come, sir, to ask you to lend me some money, and I leave this casket as an assurance that my debt will be paid back.
Very beautiful.
Indeed it is, sir. It is made of ebony. The jewels are diamonds, rubies, and sapphires. But I'm sure a gentleman in your position would know that.
And you apply to me on Mr. Septimus Luca's recommendation?
That is correct, sir.
How is it that Mr. Luca did not lend you the money himself?
Mr. Luca informed me, sir, that he had no money to lend.
I'm sorry, but Mr. Luca is quite mistaken in sending you here. Like other men in my profession, I am trusted with money to lend, but I never lend it to strangers, and never on such security as this.
I see. Thank you, sir. Before I go, will you allow me to ask you one question?
Most clients want to ask me 50. Pray ask your question.
It is this, sir. Supposing it had been possible and customary for you to lend me the money, in what space of time would it have been customary for me to pay it back?
According to the usual course pursued in this country, in 1 year from the date on which it was advanced to you.
Thank you, sir. I am deeply indebted to you. I will take up no more of your time.
Later that same afternoon, I had another caller, Mr. Septimus Luca. I made another unprofessional sacrifice to mere curiosity. I saw him.
Mr. Bruff, I owe you an apology. You've been troubled, I fear, by an Indian gentleman on my recommendation. Pray allow me, sir, to explain how I came to commit this unpardonable breach of etiquette.
Do not distress yourself, Mr. Luca. I am all attention.
It was like this. This man called on me and asked me to lend him money. He produced a beautiful little casket, and the ebony inlaid with precious stones as surety.
As he did with me.
Yes, well, let me continue. The point is, Mr. Bruff, excuse me, but no doubt you've read in the newspapers of an unfortunate incident in which I was bound and gagged and robbed of a receipt by 3 men whom I took to be Indians, by the language they spoke, that is.
Oh, yes.
So you will readily understand with what suspicion I regarded being approached again by an Indian. And more than that, and this is what really frightened me, I recognised this man as one of the 3 whom I had had occasion to complain about to the magistrate. Perhaps you heard of that too, how they kept annoying me and how I'd had to dismiss an Indian workman in ivory on suspicion of theft.
Indeed, Mr. Luca, I remember that.
Yes, well, then imagine how I felt. I thought he'd come to kill me. I could only think of the quickest way of getting rid of him. When he asked me to lend him money, I told him I hadn't any. When he asked me to recommend someone else, I told him that usually the safest course was to consult a respectable solicitor. When he asked me to name one, yours was the only name that came into my head. Really, Mr. Bruff, I do beg your pardon, but I was terrified. The perspiration was pouring off me like rain.
Yes, Mr. Luca. Well, no harm seems to have come to you. Or to me, for that matter. Perhaps we may consider the incident closed.
Oh, I do hope so, Mr. Bruff. And thank you for being so understanding.
Just one thing.
Yes, Mr. Bruff?
Did this Indian gentleman ask you a question as he was leaving?
Well, really, sir, I don't remember.
Try.
Yeah, well, let me see now. Yes, he comes back to me. He asked me, supposing I could lend him the money, how soon I would want it back.
He asked me exactly the same thing. And you know, I had the distinct impression that that was the only thing he really wanted to know.
Oh, yes, Mr. Bruff. Curious. I wonder why he should want to know that. Well, thank you for your time, Mr. Bruff, and I do hope you will overlook this breach of decorum on my part, but I was frightened for my life, sir, for my very life.
I had a dinner engagement that evening, and among the guests I discovered the Indian traveller, Mr. Murthwaite. I also discovered that he was as bored by the inevitable political small talk as much as I was. So I informed him of my close connection with the Herncastle family and with the Moonstone. I instantly had his whole attention.
And have you seen anything lately of the Indians?
I have every reason to believe that one of them came to see me in my office today.
What? You astonish me, Mr. Bruff.
He tried to borrow money from me on security of a jewelled casket. He was particularly interested in how long it would be before he had to pay the loan back, supposing I'd given it to him, which I hadn't. He tried the same trick with Septimus Luca, the dealer in precious stones, with the same result. He asked him how long before he had to pay back. Curious, that.
But surely you see his object?
I'm ashamed of my stupidity, but I'm afraid I don't.
Let me ask you one question. How far have the Indians got in their conspiracy to steal the Moonstone?
I have no idea. The Indian plot is a complete mystery to me.
That's because you've never seriously examined it. I have. Will you allow me to take you through it?
I should be obliged if you would. I'm beginning to think that if I am to serve Miss Verinder's interests, I cannot know too much about this plot.
Very well. Let us begin with the Indians themselves. It is quite clear, bearing in mind that these are men in the prime of life, not yet 40, shall we say, that they have succeeded to the men who followed Colonel Herncastle home from India. They have also succeeded to the organization.
Organization, you say? You mean there's a great network of spies and informers they can rely on?
Not a very large one, no, but sufficient for their purpose, I should say, to judge by their results so far. Now, what gave them their first chance of getting at the diamond?
Why, that would be the death of Colonel Herncastle. And I suppose their organization would have told them about that.
Of course. Up to that time, the Moonstone was safe in the strong room of a bank. I'm sure that as a lawyer you can imagine what their first course would be upon hearing of the Colonel's death.
Right to see his will, to find out what was to happen to the diamond. They could get a copy of the doctor's comments.
Exactly. Through one of those shady Englishmen I mentioned. And they would learn that the Moonstone was bequeathed to Miss Rachel Verinder, and that Mr. Blake the Elder, or some person appointed by him, was to place it in her hands. Their next difficulty was to decide whether to try and take the Moonstone when it was being removed from the bank in London, or wait until it was taken to the country house. They decided on Yorkshire as the safer course of action.
How was it that they didn't try and take the Moonstone from Lady Verinder's house before Rachel's birthday? But that's where they must have thought it would be.
But they did. Gabriel Betteridge surprised them lurking about the terrace on the first night of Franklin Blake arriving there. But having made that mistake, they didn't come near the house for 4 or 5 weeks until Miss Verinder's birthday.
But why not?
Probably because they'd made their own inquiries in the neighbourhood and had found out that Mr. Blake had put the diamond in the bank. And if they hadn't known that, they would still have waited. No Indian, Mr. Bruff, ever takes unnecessary risks. And which would have been the safer course? To try and take the diamond while it was being looked after by a young and active gentleman, or to wait until it was in the possession of a young girl who would naturally take a great delight in wearing it at every opportunity. And the proof of that is surely that they made no more attempts upon the diamond until Miss Verinder's birthday. They had calculated that she would wear it that night, and they were quite right. I was at her dinner party. I saw her wearing it. And I sent the Indians packing. They were prevented from making any further attempts because the next day they were thrown into prison as rogues and vagabonds. And that, I may fairly say, ends the first act.
Indeed. Well, so what happened next in the conspiracy?
Well, now, I'm coming to that. I was staying with some friends at Freising Hall at the time, and a day or two before the Indians were set free, the governor of the prison came to me with a letter addressed to them. It had come through the ordinary post to their lodging house, and the landlady had brought it to the prison. When he opened the letter, the governor found it was written in Hindustani. That's why he brought it to me for a translation. I made a copy in my pocketbook. Let me see.
What about the writing on the envelope?
Oh, that was in English, though not in the usual manner of addressing an envelope. Ah, here it is. Read it for yourself, Mr. Bruff.
In the name of the regent of the night, whose seat is on the antelope, whose arms embrace the 4 corners of the earth. Brothers, turn your face to the south and come to me in the street of many noises which leads down to the muddy river. The reason is this. My own eyes have seen it. Why, it's a lead to the Moonstone, is it not?
Undoubtedly. In the Hindu mythology, the god of the moon is represented with 4 arms and is seated on an antelope. Furthermore, the envelope had a Lambeth postmark.
Lambeth? That points to Mr. Luca.
Right again. The prison authorities saw no reason to hold back the letter from the Indians when I had translated it for them. And what is the first thing the Indians do when they're set free? They go to the railway station and take a train to London. Now, what is the next news we hear of the Indians?
The report in the newspaper that Mr. Luca has been annoyed by their loitering about his house in Lambeth. He applied to a magistrate for advice, I remember.
And in his statement he referred to a foreign workman.
Native of India, I remember it perfectly.
Quite. He said he'd been forced to dismiss him on suspicion of attempted theft. It's a pretty plain inference as to who wrote that letter, isn't it?
And to which of Mr. Luca's treasures he tried to steal.
You mean the Moonstone?
I do, I most certainly do. I've never doubted the Moonstone found its way into Mr. Luca's hands, however much he may deny it. The question is, who put it there?
Yes, that's what I've often asked myself. Somebody must have taken the Moonstone from Yorkshire to London, and somebody must have raised money on it, or it wouldn't have come to rest with Mr. Luca. And you say there's been no discovery made of who that person was?
None that I know of.
There was a story, was there not, about Mr. Godfrey Ablewhite?
There was, but I can tell you that Mr. Ablewhite has been completely removed from suspicion.
Is that the case? On what evidence?
Somebody... It would be a breach of confidence to tell you who. Somebody has sworn to his innocence, and I consider it evidence beyond dispute.
Very well. Let us leave it to time to clear the matter up. To return to the Indians.
Ah, yes. Pray do.
Their coming to London simply ended in their suffering another defeat.
Thanks to Mr. Luca's foresight in depositing the Moonstone with his bankers.
And in dismissing the Indian workmen. He would have given the Indians invaluable assistance in getting into the house. So the position stands at present, with the Indians knowing the Moonstone's whereabouts and quietly waiting, with their unlimited Oriental patience, for another chance of taking it. Now, do you see the object of the last question which the Indian put to you and to Mr. Luca?
Of course. He wanted to know when he could expect the Moonstone to be taken out of pledge. That's when they'll try again.
Without a shadow of a doubt. Observe the cleverness with which they work. First they find out from Mr. Luca how long it is customary to wait before repaying a loan, and then they check that statement from a respectable authority. Yourself, Mr. Bruff.
More than that, they took the receipt when they searched Mr. Luca, so they know when the Moonstone was deposited at the bank. They therefore know the earliest date at which it can be taken out of the bank.
And they will be waiting, you can be sure of that. Now, when do you think, at a rough guess, that the Moonstone found its way into Mr. Luca's possession?
Oh, as well as I can reckon it, towards the end of last June.
So, if the unknown person who pledged the Moonstone can redeem it in a year, it will be in that person's possession again at the end of June 1849. I shall be thousands of miles away, but it may be worth your while, Mr. Bruff, to be in London at that time.
Going off among the savages again, Mr. Murthwaite? Rather new than me.
I think I shall be safer among the fiercest fanatics of Central Asia than I should be if I crossed the door of the bank with the Moonstone in my pocket. The Indians have been defeated twice running. It's my firm belief they won't be defeated a third time.
I made a note of the date, end of June 49, in my pocketbook. And now I hand the pen to the writer who follows me, Mr. Franklin Blake himself.
In the spring of the year 1849, I was wandering on the borders of a desert in the east. One day, a letter reached my camp bearing a black mourning border. I opened it immediately. It informed me that my father was dead, that I was heir to his great fortune, and that Mr. Bruff begged me to lose no time in returning to England. At dawn the next day I was on my way home, and eventually arrived in Yorkshire.
Mr. Franklin, as I live by bread.
Betteridge.
Home at last. And how are you, sir? No need to ask. You look fighting fit.
And you get younger, Betteridge, with every year that passes.
No, not so, sir. Not so. Oh, but there have been sad changes since you went away. The house all shut up and the servants gone, but I'll cook your dinner and the gardener's wife will make your bed.
Betteridge, my dear old friend, I cannot enter this house tonight.
What's that you say? You not enter this house where you spent the happiest years of your life?
That's all gone and will never come again.
But my lady would... You know about my lady?
I do, Betteridge, I do. No, but I was thinking about Rachel. This is her house now, and I cannot enter it, and eat in it, and sleep in it, as things are between us.
I'm sorry to hear that, sir. Have you seen Miss Rachel since your return?
Oh, would that I had. You know she's under Miss Merridew's guardianship now.
Oh, yes, a sister of Sir John. A widow, is she not?
Yes, and I've been to her house in Portland Place, but Rachel won't see me. She won't even write to me. I own it cuts deep, Betteridge, and that's why I cannot come in. Now, I shall walk over to Frisinghall and stay at the hotel.
Oh, there's no need to do that, sir. There's Hotherstone's farm nearby, and you can hardly object to that. Hotherstone lives on his own freehold. They let rooms to anglers and artists and such like.
And are they free now?
Mrs. Hotherstone asked for my good word to recommend them only yesterday.
Oh, then I'll take them. And you must come and have breakfast with me tomorrow.
I'm heartily sorry, sir, to hear the way things still are between you and Miss Rachel. I had hoped they were all smoothed over by now.
Oh, so had I. But she still can't forgive me for that business of the Moonstone. And, that's why I'm here now.
Oh, sir, you've not come to take that up again.
I have, Betteridge. I've got to get to the bottom
of
it.
No, sir, let it be. That cursed diamond has misguided everybody who's come near it. No. Let it be, Mr. Franklin.
Betteridge, I can't. It's as simple as that. I can't. It's the only way I can see to put things right again between Rachel and me.
Have you thought, sir? Supposing you make any discoveries, what you might find out about Miss Rachel?
I'm as sure of her as you are. Now, whatever I find out, nothing can alter my opinion of her. The question is, how on earth do I begin when even the great Sergeant Cuff failed?
I can put you on the track, Mr. Franklin, if you're sure you want me to.
You, Betteridge? In heaven's name, how?
Do you remember Rosanna Spearman?
Of course. I always thought the poor girl was trying to make some sort of confession to me about the Moonstone.
I think you can find out what that confession was, whenever you please.
What?
She left a letter, sir. A letter addressed to you.
Have you got it?
No, sir.
And where is it?
At the fishing village, Cobb's Hole. Lucy Yolland has it.
But why wasn't it sent on to me?
Because Rosanna also left Lucy a note, in which she said your letter was to be given into your hands and no other way. Lucy had such a regard for Rosanna that nothing would make her part with it. And besides, you'd left for abroad before I could write to you.
Well, let's go and get it at once.
Wouldn't do any good, sir. They're great savers of candles along our coast, and they go to bed very early at Cobb's Hole.
We could be there in half an hour.
You might, sir. And when you get there, you'd find the door locked and bolted. Much better wait until tomorrow. I'll come with you.
Early?
As early as you like, sir.
I didn't wait for breakfast at the farm next morning. I took a crust of bread in my hand and set out. I had some misgivings that I might surprise Betteridge in his bed, but I found him ready and waiting, with his stick in his hand.
Good morning, Mr. Franklin. A good night at the farm.
I own I didn't sleep much. Too excited. And how are you this morning?
Very poorly, sir.
Oh, I'm sorry to hear it. What's the trouble?
A new disease, sir. I don't want to alarm you, but you're certain to catch it before the morning is out.
The devil I am.
It'll lay hold of you at Cobb's Hole. I first caught it in the company of Sergeant Cuff, and I call it the detective fever.
Sergeant Cuff. Yes, I might want a few words with him.
I'm afraid he's retired now, sir. Got a little cottage at Dorking and up to his eyes in the growing of roses.
Well, then I must do without his help.
I assume you know all that has happened regarding the Moonstone while you've been abroad?
Yes, Mr. Bruff told me everything as soon as I got back. To tell you the truth, Betteridge, the one grain of consolation I found was the fact that Rachel withdrew from her marriage engagement to Godfrey Ablewhite. How she could have contemplated it, I really don't know. Lucy Yolland insisted on taking me down to the beach before she would give me the letter. She led me behind some boats, out of the sight and hearing of the few people in the village. She had a limp, it is true, but also remarkably beautiful hair. And there was a fierce keenness in her eyes. That she had no love for me was obvious from the start.
So you are Mr. Franklin Blake?
I am. Perhaps you would like to see some formal identification before you give me the letter. I believe I have a note here from my lawyer, Mr.
No, I don't want any lawyer's notes. Mr. Betteridge brought you, that's good enough for me. I just want to look at you first. I just want to see you with her eyes.
Well, if you insist.
I do insist. It's the least you can do for her. No. I can't see what you saw in your face or your eyes. I can't hear what she heard in your voice, the poor daft thing. You know she'd be living now if it weren't for you, Franklin Blake.
What? I scarcely knew the girl. I certainly never encouraged her in any way.
Oh, no, you wouldn't, would you, with a shoulder like hers? Well, she was in love with you, God rest her.
In love?
Yes. No, I can't see why. You're not even average height.
Now, look here.
And that's why she killed herself, because you never noticed her. Oh, but for you, we'd have been in London now, living together like sisters and earning an honest living from our needles. Oh, I suppose that doesn't seem much to you, does it? But it's better than living in service to someone like you, who tears your heart out every time he looks at you. Here, take your letter. I don't know what's in it, and I don't care. All I hope is I never set eyes on you again.
Extraordinary girl. She must be mad. Well, now, this letter.
If you want to know the meaning of my behaviour to you while you were staying at Lady Verinder's, do what the enclosed instructions tell you to do. Your humble servant, Rosanna Spearman. Go to the shivering sand at the turn of the tide. What on earth? Walk out on the South Spit until you get to the beacon and the Coast Guard station in line.
Mr. Franklin? I can't stand it any longer. What does it say?
Here, read it yourself.
Go to Shivering Sand, turn of tide, get beacon and Coast Guard station in line, lay a stick down on the rocks. I knew it, sir. I knew it.
Knew what, Betteridge? And you're right, man. I have got the detective fever. So, what does all this rigmarole mean?
Sergeant Cuff said it all along. From first to last, sir. He said she'd got a note of how to get to the hiding place, and this is it. Lord save us. Here's the secret that puzzled even the great Cuff, ready and waiting to show itself to you. Now then, at the turn of the tide, she says. It's the ebb now, but when's the turn? There's young Duffy over at the nets, he'll know. Duffy! Duffy, hello! How long till the turn of the tide?
Oh, about half an hour, I should say.
Come along, Mr. Franklin. We can just get round to the South Spit before the turn, but we must hurry.
Betteridge, refresh my memory. What part did Rosanna Spearman play in all this?
Sergeant Cuff thought that she was shielding someone, sir.
Rachel? Well, out with it, Betteridge. We'll be facing the truth in a few minutes, like it or not.
Yes, sir. He thought Miss Rachel had taken Rosanna into her confidence. And there were suspicious circumstances. Rosanna saying she was ill in her room when really she was over in Frising Hall buying the stuff for a servant's nightgown.
Did Sergeant Cuff prove that to his satisfaction?
Oh, yes, sir. Had it from Maltby, the linen draper that she bought the material. He suspected that she'd hidden the old one, but he could never prove it.
Why should she make a nightgown?
Because it was she who smeared the paint on the door with her own when she was visiting Miss Rachel in the early hours of the morning, before the paint was dry.
But supposing that to be true, why hide it? It might accidentally come to light. If it was evidence against Rosanna Spearman, surely she'd have destroyed it, burnt it, or thrown it in the quicksand.
That's what puzzled the sergeant. I don't think he liked to think, sir, that a servant girl had got the better of him. She bought a tin trunk and some chain from Mr. Yolland, and that's how she hid it. Somewhere out there, in the water.
Now then, Betteridge, let's have your stick.
Here you are, sir.
She says we're to lay it along the edge of the rocks on the side overlooking the quicksand. Right. What next?
Feel along the stick among the seaweed. She says you'll find the chain.
I can't find any chain, only seaweed.
Get your hand well in among the weeds, sir. It might have grown up a lot since Rosanna hid it here.
Wait a minute.
Huh?
What's this?
Have you found it, sir?
I think so. It's deep in among the weeds. Yes, I've got it. It's come free. There. Well, there it is, Betteridge.
It's all rusty, sir.
Let's hope it's watertight. The lid's rusted fast. Never mind. Let's grip it between my knees. Now. Got it!
Oh, well done, sir. Well done. Now then.
There's no water inside. A letter. My name on it.
A linen, sir. A nightgown.
Well, let's open it out and see. Yes. Yes, it's a nightgown, all right.
And is there a stain of paint on it, sir?
No. Not this side, so far as I can see.
Turn it over, sir. Turn it over. Here, let me help you.
Yes. Yes, there it is, Betteridge. Look!
This trifle of your Superintendent Seagrave has grown a little in importance since you noticed it. We have now to look for an article of dress in this house with a smear of paint on it, and to ask the owner of that article how he or she can account for being in Miss Verender's sitting room in the early hours of Thursday morning. If that person can't satisfy us, we haven't far to look for the hand that took the diamond.
Mr. Franklin, sir?
Yes, Betteridge?
I said, is there a name in the nightgown?
Oh, yes. Wait a minute. Let's see. Oh, my God.
What's the matter, sir?
Betteridge. The name is my own. This is my nightgown. It's mine.
That was part 4 of The Moonstone by Wilkie Collins, dramatised for radio by Brian Gear. The cast: Sergeant Cuff, John Franklin Robbins, Gabriel Betteridge, John Sharp, Franklin Blake, John Telfer, Rachel Verender, Sally Baxter, Godfrey Ablewhite, Geoffrey Beavers, Mr. Bruff, Nat Brenner, Miss Clack, June Barry, Mr. Ablewhite, Godfrey Kenton, Aunt Ablewhite, Margot Boyd, Mr. Mirthwaite, Gordon DeLew, Septimus Luca, Adrian Egan, the Indian, Geoffrey Searle, Lucy Yolland, Liza Flanagan, and Duffy, Debbie Cumming. The music was composed and conducted by Sidney Sager, and the programme, which came from Bristol, was directed by Brian Miller.